We would like to carry on with our program. Please return to be seated. The next session, from a certain point of view, will be a continuation of the one we just participated in. It is part of that chapter wherein we talk about national resilience and not only national security, which is considered a strategic issue. And this national resilience is no less strategic than national security. This session that we're now going to sit in will deal in the questions of Israeli democracy and the prevention and the battle against corruption in the public life in Israel. In other words, Israel's democracy and the rule of law. It's going to be a rather exceptional session. Usually, journalists interview others. This session, Major General Amos Gilead, the Executive Director of the IPS, the Institute for Policy and Strategy, Major General, Reserves, Amos Gilead, is going to interview and talk with two very senior investigative journalists who are used to interviewing others. These senior journalists and correspondents are Ilana Dayan and Raviv Drucker. It is a privilege for me to invite Major General Amos Gilead, Dr. Ilana Dayan, and Mr. Raviv Drucker. I would like to sit on the left-hand side, please, said Ilana Dayan. Good afternoon. I was asked to do something rather exceptional, and I agreed to do so and took these two leading forces that keep exposing and revealing all the terrible things that happen here, that in reality, by the way, they're even worse than they appear to be. And Normally, I like being interviewed by them, but out of a deep admiration for both of them, I decided that I would unite forces and work together with such professional forces that are sitting here. I'm absolutely maddened by what is happening here. There are things that I'm more familiar with or less, vis-a-vis the submarine issues that flooded up to the surface. People ostensibly involved in horrific things. I have to be very careful with my wording because we might actually be indicted without a hearing. No, but there's certain things can be done without sort of necessarily criminal issues. I mean, we were talking about the criminal law that also dealt in various lacunae. But there are all sorts of affairs that came up in different programs on the media. Are we a corrupt country? Can we actually deal with it? Have we got the tools? How come such senior officials, for example, in the Prime Minister's Bureau, they're dealing with such terrible things, and yet they're continuing to work, and their legitimacy is not actually in any way detrimentally affected? Explain it to me. Okay, Ilana? No, you start, Raviv. Well, are we a corrupt state? There are various indices. Hello, one and all, first of all. First of all, if we are talking about the specific perceptions that we have of people, I think I was asked by a number of people, Moshe Lador, Yuda Weinstein, Shai Nitzan, I asked, that question, and no one knew how to answer it. I mean, these are senior officials that I asked, and I actually came up with a different answer. I think that our highest echelons nowadays is corrupt, yes, because simply, empirically, you can see that if our last 4 prime ministers were actually investigated under caution, as suspects, each of them, it was actually subject to a hearing, and our president was actually jailed. Another one was actually accused of actual sexual harassment, and others. I mean, if you're talking about all the various authorities, and I can give you a whole enumeration of all the lists of all the most senior echelons, I think it would be fair just to say that yes, it is corrupt in an unprecedented manner. And I would like to actually now test the audience about various portfolios that really was sort of scandalized our country just a few years ago. Nomi Blumenthal's case, for example, what she did, if anyone remembers what she did. Yes, it became an administrative offense. I think she should have been given the chivalry prize of law. So she actually brought a few people to sleep actually in one of the best hotels and then hid the whole thing. Was that an offense? Arik Sharon was so shocked by the offense that he actually announced that if she does not actually talk, she wanted to take the Fifth Amendment in her investigation. And she decided that, and he said that she must speak. I mean, it was really, he was shocked also by the idea that she'd done so little. I mean, for that small sum of money, I mean, we're talking about millions in bank accounts, and no one was indicted. So I think that definitely that 20 or 30 years ago, this did not happen. This is truly unprecedented from the point of view of the corruption. Whatever separated between us and the place that I was born in, South America, is the fact is that we always knew that there were sufficient mechanisms and that were inquisitive enough and aggressive enough that would be able to ventilate that corruption, which is our role, and also to actually challenge it and to enforce the law. And that is that crispy layer that we need to break through and fight against. Now, just imagine that horrific scenario. And 1,000 times we were asked, and they asked, are we in the direction of the end of democracy and doomsday to democracy? Now, if we're talking about the overriding clause, including overriding over specific legislation and the bill, and let's say that the Prime Minister is going to find himself in a situation of immunity, it will be awarded to him. But from a legal point of view, constitutional point of view, it cannot be actually annulled and abolished. But on the other hand, how can one find ourselves extricating ourselves from that kind of actually scenarios? Are we going to find the Dorit Bainishes and the Agranats who are going to come and take a strong stand and come up with the upper hand and say, no, this cannot happen here? Is this what is differentiating between us and those truly corrupt countries, for example, like Brazil and Venezuela? Is what is discerning between us? It's not the corruption itself. There was corruption in the historical Mapai, but we didn't have the investigative journalists who found it. The difference always was that there were systems who knew how to reveal it, expose it, and deal with it. Shake it up. It's not that the democracy is actually is really in a treacherous situation, but I think that I'd like to know whether the younger state attorneys, what are they going to do? Are they going to be as determined and fight against it? What is happening to our gatekeepers? Are they being gnawed away at and corroded? Now, what happens to Al-Sheikh, who didn't want to actually give up his stand? And what happened to others? What will happen to that little boy who put his finger in the dam? What happens when the actual systems go on a defensive, when our gatekeepers are on a defensive? What will then happen? Will there still be whistleblowers? Well, the situation is much more grave than I actually even imagined. This is a really progressive stage that we find ourselves. Now we're going to find those attacks, real attacks against the gatekeepers. This is a message that is slowly but surely permeating all the way down. You won't have 433 very soon. They may want to abolish that investigative unit, and we won't have those elite units. Instead, we'll just have those who deal with bullies in the street, and the guy actually going around the block with the constable. I don't want to actually talk about intimidation and comparing us to Erdogan or Putin and say this is an apocalyptic state and doomsday is on the verge. No, I don't think that we are there, but I do believe, very similarly to Ilana and you, that the story of the gatekeepers is a very great story, but it is a very boring one to say that what happens to the end of a specific unit. Is he promoted after that, at the end of his term of office? No, I think that those who did deal with the investigations against a prime minister, and we suddenly find that person was fired and he suddenly did lose his job. So let's say the state controller, who never believed that he would believe in the state control, he never in his wildest dreams did he believe that he would be sworn in as a state controller. That literally sounds something as if it came out of Smotrich, the member of Keshet, actually sort of textbook. Someone who says that I don't need to actually audit and control those specific decisions when they are being taken at that moment. I can only do it later on. Then he certainly doesn't understand what his true role is. And if you talk about the actually race for the state attorney's position that's going to take place in December, and there are about 15 candidates who actually they will decide what is the actual character of the struggle. When we see ourselves on the television, we're not really important. But believe me, those who actually get that decision in their hands, and they have got to make the ruling whether something should be investigated or not. It was lying in their drawer for nearly 6 months, and it suddenly peeped out of the drawer. And thank God it stopped something terrible happening, like Fuad Ben Eliezer when he was a candidate to be the president, and suddenly the investigation burst into the news.
You can call them gatekeepers, you can call them leadership. This thing that's now being beaten on behalf of governance. There's something that we have to think about, the new fashion to attack the civil servants because they are not elected. Only the one who is elected is democratic. Only politicians can determine. Only ministers can do the policy. And all the others, all the CEOs and the movie law. And of course the question that has to do with the authorities of the Supreme Court. And it's really boring. And I ask myself, what chance for our journalists will have a program on it? Because it's, what is this? It's just a lesson in civil rights that starts to explain that anybody who tries to tell us that democracy is what the people want, and democracy is what the majority elected. And I'm thinking, what kind of way can we invent in order to explain that democracy is what the minority needs, not what the majority wants? And it goes hand in hand. You know, the state attorney, you know, the last innovation, by the way, of the Puritan Democrat says that if the public elected the prime ministers, although he has 3 indictments, so there's trust. If there's trust, then he didn't do anything wrong. This is logic. It's great. It's exactly the metrics. But the point is, and that's the thing that I think, if there's anything that really bothers me at night, we are generalists. I distinguish between the great discussion in the Israeli society about the future of the territories and the settlements, the greater Israel, or that the occupation corrupts. This is a discussion of 2 sides. And the truth is that every side has to assume that the other side is right. And the difference in the discussion today between the Democrats and those who try to inculcate an anorectic democratic, thin, empty, that talks about everything just because of the majority. This is democracy that threatens the real existence of the gatekeepers. And the gatekeepers is everyone, from the chief of police to the state controller, to the investigating journalist, to the CEO of the Ministry of Justice or Finance. Each of them was not elected. He doesn't service a majority, but the more deeper things, the real values of democracy. You don't have to go to the ballot poll in order to know that we want a state where there's law and order, equality before the law, freedom, living in dignity. This is so simple, and for some reason it went astray. What happened? I want to ask you, I have a feeling that there's no punishment and reward. How come so senior people are so involved in criminal acts? Because of two aspects. One, the acts themselves. When do they work for the benefit of the state? I'm trying to imagine all these suspects. I'm saying the suspects, of course, subject to the hearing. If I take all these corruptions, I worked for this country for decades, and I never found time to go to sleep. When do they work? When do they care about the state? When do they make sure that our interests, what is this, as indifference? What's going on? How come everything takes so long? Look, I think that the thing that really adds another level of problematics. When we look at the Bar-On Hebron case from 1997, and the protagonists, they were Yvette Lieberman, Tzachi Hanegbi, Benjamin Netanyahu, all of them are still with us. And Aryeh Deri, they're all here as if nothing happened. Nobody was replaced. Yes, Tzachi Hanegbi as well, they're all here. No one was ever replaced. And there's a certain stage where a person, I think Arik Sharon was part of it, and Peres and Netanyahu, definitely, that there's no point to say anything about you anymore because you're like, you got a chain of immunity, not by the television people, but from the public. The public said, everything was said about you, who cares? Today, really, I think, what kind of investigation can anybody bring me on Netanyahu that will be worthy of publication? Another story that Sarah, the wife, threw the socks out of the window. Who cares? These things go like nothing. So what? There's some funny arrangement that was done with her, with a plea bargain. But what Bibi was investigated at the time was much less than what Sarah Netanyahu, the wife, admitted. And she got a fee of what? A third of the sum that she admitted to. So I'm saying there's some sort of there's some people here that because of this rule that here we don't pay a price, you always stay in the system, there's nothing anymore that you can, if the law does not indict them, there's nothing you can do to Aryeh Deri. What can you do to him anymore? Not because of the fact that you cannot. You can, but who cares? Nobody's interested. You said everything. He was already indicted. He sat in prison. What are you going to say? That he appointed somebody that he shouldn't have? Look, if we talk about some affairs, what kind of a funnel came? There were many, many cases, but it finished with a very little thing. There were 400,000 shekels about the meal, and then it went for mediation, and eventually the Sarah, the wife, admitted that she paid 55,000. After they finalized that's what she's going to pay, the judge said it's a mistake, and the verdict, this was also, so she did invite the people or not, but it goes, and this is after the things that I'm sure that law enforcement also left it aside. But to your question, Amos, we have to say truthfully, and I'm asking both of you, the question, whether, in fact, anybody sitting here in this hall can say honestly that if Bibi Netanyahu, and many people justly think that he doesn't sit there and just waste his time, that he did many things and he's got a lot of records and political and diplomatic achievements and whatever, and most of the Israelis live a very good life. And he also did a lot in the economy. But I'm asking you, if Netanyahu tomorrow goes close to Abu Mazen, to the Abbas, and to him. I think that there's a historic moment here because of the Gulf countries and Trump and the deal and whatever. We can now go to a historical process. Is it possible that a lot of the people sitting in this hall will say, okay, look, finally we're talking about some cigars and champagne and whoever, but he can really now make a historical turnover and you're going to look at it completely differently? Me? Okay, now I'm the interviewee. Look, I think that there's no such thing just keeping somebody in an envelope. We're talking about national resilience. If there's no national immunity, then the termites are going to eat the house. I'm against mercy to people who deviate from the norm. And there's no probability that he's going to go to talk to Abu Mazen. It's easy to answer because it's not going to happen. But even if it does happen, I think that we cannot, it's not just criminal acts, I'm telling you. I'm also bothered by the lack of orders and by people, Likasses, all those officers said yes, 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 in Yom Kippur, like a herd of sheep. And finally we had 3,000 casualties. The first Lebanon war, also the same thing. There it was even worse. And eventually we're going to find ourselves in a very dangerous place. That's my experience, my experiences, that's what I think. So if you ask me, what about keeping Netanyahu in kid gloves? Although I'm not realistic, but I'm very bothered by the fact that what's going to happen? It's going all over the place. So who has the courage to say anything? If the legal advisors are going to be yes men, and if the controller is going to be like you're describing him, then what's going to happen to us? I'll tell you, to your question, Ilana, I think we all stood to the test when Sharon did exactly that, and look at the results. Some of the journalists maybe kept him in kid gloves. It's difficult to say it about him because they continued with their criminal cases, and the credit to Sharon that he didn't wage a bloody war against the state attorney and the police and the government. He had a lot of complaints and a lot of arguments. There were 4 cases against him, by the way, with quite a lot of evidence. So let's say to this value-based question, I agree with you that some of the people, it's going to impact their position towards the prime minister, but the values has to be unequivocal. You don't make peace and when you're rotten, and you don't hand over territories when you're rotten. You don't go neither here nor there. By the way, Bibi Netanyahu, people who know him will tell you in the Likud, he's today in the most right-wing position ever, and he's in this position ever because of his personal cases. It's exactly the opposite, and in order to be accepted by his base, he forgot the two-state solution, he forgot anything. He's the most right-wing, and he's ready to say to the court, he was Bainish shoulders at the time, the state Supreme Court president, and it's true, and you're right, and I'm saying, if you look a little bit ahead, maybe I'm just looking for a reason for optimism. Maybe this is a golden opportunity. Just as Benjamin Netanyahu, almost no doubtedly, because of his personal and legal distress, is jumping all over the authorities and enforcement and unfortunately the Supreme Court. And he's talking about a witch hunt of people that he appointed against him. And now we talk in his name that there's no court that will exonerate him. Maybe because of that. The system itself, that same system that is not elected, that system that is supposed to work according to the Constitution and in perpetuation of the values. In other words, the Supreme Court has to stand up to the occasion and to say, because of that, because he's taking advantage of this minute in order to attack, we're going to defend ourselves inwardly. And maybe this system, headed by the Supreme Court and the President of the Supreme Court, they should say, we are ready for a change, to look at ourselves and to check ourselves. Maybe, perhaps, we, at certain points, we were perceived as ones who are trampling all over the Israeli society. Maybe were we blind to the needs of the Israeli society. Maybe we were condescending. Maybe we acted as if we're elite. And perhaps we can look at it in a different way on this constitutional crisis, which I think is really alarming. It is. And to say just a minute, just as the Supreme Court did not liquidate democracy, the tension among the authorities is healthy. It's sometimes difficult and stormy. But now let's try to think. Maybe, yes, maybe we can find the way. And that's really lacking. As Sharon said, that there's no negotiation under fire. I think that the Supreme Court, they have a lot what to amend and a lot what to improve. You can discuss it at length. We can see what happened with the mayor of Herzliya. I don't even know her, but we can talk about Muhammad Katos just recently, about the guy. But all of a sudden, they will form a committee and try to amend it. It looks as if they are surrendering to the pressure. Okay, she says. It's a good idea, but the question is what has to come first. If we talk about an amendment of something that's completely rotten, then the rotten is going to overcome the amended. Because there are no committees, it's the best thing to kill any amendment. This is a genius invention. And you inform another committee, then you have another committee to implement results that never happened. I wanted to ask you, do you think there's also a decline in the scope of investigations in all our press? You, maybe I'm mistaken, you remain these two, very forceful journalists, but do you think that some of the media, without naming names, they despaired of investigations? The answer is that the last recent years, I say yes. The last few years, I want to explain it. It's not this heroic situation of that the pressure of the share owner, and he said, don't press play on the investigation of next week. There's a real economic crisis in the media. If I had to grade the first 10 reasons, and Netanyahu is not one of the 10. All the reasons are economy. I don't want to go into the economy to economics because investigations are very expensive. So if Maariv, the newspaper, is barely living, there are no investigation. Yediot Ahronot, another newspaper, with all my criticism, it was an illustrious newspaper with investigations, not always correct, but they were investigations. Now they don't exist, almost, in that newspapers. The last reporters who left, maybe one or two were left, but a newspaper that was a superpower of the press, there are no investigations. But if you go today to the Excel of any journalist and ask them why do investigation? What justifies it? They can do with the same money. They'll have more rating and they won't get entangled with all sorts of legal problems. It's just not it's not lucrative. I think the only reason that some of them do is you want to remain dignified. You don't want to be a CEO of Italian TV that only does soap operas and naked women. Maybe because we're there, Raviv, because today we're there already. Okay, maybe we are. So if today we start from the beginning, maybe nobody would even start. I agree with Raviv altogether, but I just want to say that when we broadcast just 4 weeks ago, investigation that a day before already a lawsuit was submitted in London, then it's obvious that unless you broadcast it with a stable body which backs you, I hope we don't have a lawsuit, then it's obvious that you cannot do it. But in my mind, everything we spoke about in the last half hours and also the last question of yours, Amos, only strengthens the feeling that we have to hold strong. We have the luck and the privilege and the right to do what we do. We have to hold strong. If there's anything that motivates me, I think 2 years ago, the movie came out, The Post. Remember the Washington Post with the Pentagon Papers issue? And I remember that this story, as huge as it is and epical, it's our stories of daily life, because eventually what happened there was that one very courageous man, some of the people that you're talking about, Amos, you were one, within the system, one courageous man who understood that the American administration is lying to the American people for 20 years. Daniel Ellsberg, and he brought to the journalists the cases. This is our wild dream. Somebody will come with the suitcases and give them. So there'll always be somebody at the end that will bring those cases, and there'll always be the journalist that will want to expose them. And we'll always have the owner who is going to say, exactly like in the Washington Post, that he'll be afraid to do it, and always be the Nixon who will do any effort in order to prevent the exposure. And I was surprised that Lyndon Johnson at the time, when you see him saying, how will we win this war with these sons of bitches? There'll always these people that will want to trample on us and silence us. And in that, one episode to conclude that illustrates, and you're right, we're not Turkey or Erdogan, something that illustrated to me what we have to be afraid of. After I interviewed Erdogan 3 years ago, I think it was a week before the submarine issue, and I came back, and it was in Turkish. You had to translate, and we brought two women who just came from Turkey, 25 years old, to start translating the interview until we bring the professional translator. And so I'm sitting to edit the interview, and there's one sentence they did not translate. I called one of them, said, what does he say here? Because I was told something, and I thought I understood it. She said, forget it, leave it, it's something, it doesn't matter. I said, but what is he saying? She says, no, it's not important, it's technical. Okay, what? Tell me, what's technical? And she says, he said that if you continue to stop him and to behave this way, he'll have to think whether he's going to be continued to interview. What did I learn from that? She grew up in a climate that this is something you cannot translate. This is possible, it's okay, it's forgiven. Why translate it? And I think this is a red light. That's very similar to what happened to Naomi Blumenthal many years ago, but I think that's exactly the thing we have to afraid not to get to. Maybe this is the solution. There'll be no investigation, no interviews, and everybody will be happy. Thank you. We can go on with you for another 2 hours, but time is up. Thank you very much, Ilana.